we've seen scholars delving into 19th century records to uncover surprisingly rich and varied accounts of asylum life. Now, their studies have recaptured the sorts of people committed to asylums, the treatments they received, and their experiences of institutionalisation. And the emerging pictures have been punctuated by staff violence, filth, overcrowding, and a mounting pessimism about medicine's ability to cure insanity. But in spite of this indisputable progress in reclaiming the history of Ireland's mentally ill and their caregivers, we find that scholarship on Irish asylum patients is focused overwhelmingly on the poor. Now, we could argue that this really reflects a historical reality. The majority of patients in Irish asylums were admitted as paupers. But as my research has shown, if we shift our focus away from the poor and compare the care options for other social groups, we can expose the importance of factors like patients' social backgrounds, their gender and religious persuasion, to psychiatrists' understandings of mental illness and patients' experiences of it. Now, these factors came to define provision for the mentally ill, resulting in a uniquely Irish institutional framework. By the 1870s, Ireland had a three-tier system. The public or district asylums, which were originally intended for the lunatic poor, began to charge some patients for accommodation. Then the voluntary asylums received both paying patients and free patients who were considered as respectable but who may have fallen in hard times. Then finally we had the private asylums, which catered almost exclusively for private patients. But there were some patients in them that had originally been admitted as private patients, but if their families fell in hard times, they're often kept on by the asylum providers as charitable cases, but they're few and far between. Now, just to give you a sense of the scale of the system, by 1900 there were 22 public asylums accommodating almost 16,000 patients. It was the growing demand for mental health care for other social groups that prompted the decision in 1870 to allow some fee-paying patients into the district or public asylums, and these were charged between about £6 and £24 per annum, depending on how much they could afford, so it was means tested. Out of this 16,000, only around 3% actually contributed anything towards the cost of their care. Now, on the opposite end of the scale, we had the private asylum system, which were charging extremely high fees that were out of the reach of the majority of Irish society. We're talking usually a few £100s per annum. Then by 1900, there was only 13 private asylums catering for about 300 patients. Then meanwhile, the third part of the three-tier system, the voluntary asylums, occupied a middle ground, offering less expensive fees to those who could not afford private asylums, so from around £24, the top end of the district system, right to a few £100s. So by 1900, there were 4 of these hospitals, and they housed around 400 patients. So my wider overall research surveys the records of 9 mental hospitals, 4 public, 2 voluntary, and 3 private. In the course of my research, I've examined the social and medical background of more than 2,000 patients, as well as hundreds of psychiatric case notes, patients' letters, asylum annual reports, advertisements, and minute books. But just for today, I'm going to focus mainly on evidence drawn from doctors' case notes written in the 1890s. I'm going to restrict my focus to paying patients in 2 public and 2 voluntary hospitals, just so we don't get too bogged down with the comparisons between the 9 I originally looked at. These case notes were compiled by asylum doctors who visited and interviewed patients in the asylums, and they often contain transcripts of the conversations that were held between them. So as such, we can say that the patient's views were very much mediated through the doctor, the reporting physician. But nonetheless, these notes do provide us with the best indicators we have of patients' perceptions, experiences, and expectations of asylum life. Now, the 2 public asylums I'm going to discuss today are the Richmond Asylum, better known to many of us as Grange Gorman, found in Dublin, and the Enniscorthy District Asylum in Wexford. The 2 voluntary asylums are the Bloomfield Retreat, originally in Donnybrook, but now a nursing home in Rathfarnham, and the Stewart's Institution, which is in Palmerstown. My paper will comprise 2 sections. In part 1, I'm going to discuss patients' articulation of class, religious, and political tensions within asylum communities. Then in the second section, I'm going to contrast the experiences of patients in public and voluntary asylums in terms of the work they performed there and the amusements and diversions that were provided to them. So families who could afford to pay fees were often reluctant to commit relatives to public asylums. The main reason for this reluctance was that special rules stipulated that paying patients must be cared for under the same conditions as the resident pauper patients. Now, this extended to food and even the clothing, and any relatives or friends who offered to supply clothing or additional dietary items were usually refused, as was the rule. Now, while these measures were intended to guard against anticipated jealousies among paupers, they were perceived by many as ill-suited for those of a higher social status. Moreover, the stigma attached to having a relative in a primarily pauper institution sometimes deterred those who were anxious to assert their respectability. So paying patients differed from paupers both in the socio-economic and religious profile. The typical pauper patient was Catholic and required a certificate of poverty to gain admission. Paying patients, while also more likely to be Catholic, were actually disproportionately Protestant compared to the general population of Ireland or of the asylum populations that they joined. By definition, of course, paying patients, or at least their relatives, had at least a degree of financial means as well. So the accommodation of this new group, paying patients, spawned changes in the social environment. The influx of paying patients led to class tensions, at times culminating in violence towards other patients and staff members. Religious and political divisions were also manifest among this cohort. So the doctor's case notes from the 1890s that I'll speak about today reveal that paying patients at Enniscorthy tended to associate with one another, and it's very likely that they in fact formed their own subgroup within the wider asylum population. Now, this tendency most likely stemmed either from their prejudice or even their fear of the paupers that they were forced to cohabit with. So just to give some examples, Richmond paying patient Elizabeth H. stated, and I quote, "I hate being here with these dirty, abominable women, their dirty language at mealtimes." James S., a farmer at Enniscorthy, complained, "This is no place to have me, they are all madmen and ruffians here." And Frances N. in Richmond was eager to differentiate herself from the pauper patients, quote, "said she was not a pauper like the others." Now, asylum staff in Ireland tended to be considered as low-ranking in society, and as a result, class tensions between the more affluent paying patient and the less wealthy asylum worker could arise. Female paying patients at Richmond were particularly vocal about their distaste for attendants of physicians. So Rose C., quote, wrote a letter full of abuse of the doctors, attendants, patients, and the asylum more generally. And then Catherine B. was described as extremely disdainful in manner, says an heiress's life would suit her, objects to associating with Nurse Murphy and Nurse Hagens and Doctors in Shadows, says she should own this institution, and says I'm taking a great liberty in speaking to her. Now, not all paying patients were displeased with their accommodation or attendance, although these were few and far between from the research that I have done. So one lady, Maria F., spoke most highly of the Richmond Asylum, saying, quote, "We are blessed with good attendance," and expressing the highest recommendation of the arrangements there. But back at Enniscorthy, James C. had a blatant distaste for servants and asylum staff. Prior to his admission, James had attacked a servant in his brother's house, threatening and striking him. And then while in the asylum, he threw stones at a painter and a few days later attacked one of the attendants. Another paying patient, Eliza M., also reportedly slapped the male servants. Now, while these violent outbursts were not confined to paying patients, existing tensions in the relationship between staff and patients could only have been exacerbated by social inequalities between the two parties. So as I mentioned, alongside social class, religion played an important role in patients' identity. In Enniscorthy, Edward S. reportedly had an aversion to Protestants, all of whom he regards as Orangemen. And Moore, an attendant, often heard him muttering when he passed, for example, that if he had a chance, he would do away with all of the Orangemen and Protestants. Edward also accused a fellow Roman Catholic patient of becoming a Protestant in order to get the privileges, which the doctor interpreted as him being allowed to walk around on parole. So religious tensions were also visible in the Richmond Asylum. Ellen C., a Protestant woman, would forgive her husband anything but putting her where the majority are Roman Catholics, considers that her kneeling to say prayers is made a subject of remark. On my pointing out to her, this is the doctor speaking, that many patients are seen kneeling in the dormitories, she replies, they are Roman Catholics. She also complained that another patient spoke to her about priests and nuns. So, inextricably linked with these religious tensions in Ireland was political unrest. I think we know it would be an understatement to say that the 19th century was a particularly turbulent period in Irish history, host as it was to famine, massive land agitation, emigration, and towards the end of the century, an enduring economic depression. So in his 1894 article on the alleged increase of insanity in Ireland, Enniscorthy's resident medical superintendent, Dr. Thomas Drapes, wrote, it's a long quote here on the screen, "The almost constant political agitation to which our people are subjected, deeply arousing as it does the feelings of a naturally emotional race. Mr. Lecky says somewhere, religion is the one romance of the poor. There is another which, as a vision of the future, haunts the mind of the Irish peasant. Rent abolished, his land and homestead for himself, and a parliament in College Green. These are the dreams which fill his fancy. Disappointed often, but still not despairing, betrayed as he has often been, he still clings with a wonderful tenacity to the picture of an ideal Ireland. But the hopes, fears, and anxieties, the stirring up of emotions, some evil, some generous, engendered by this almost chronic condition of political unrest, can hardly fail to have a more or less injurious effect on a not overstable kind of brain. Now, despite Drapes' emphasis on the Irish peasant, discussion of politics was prevalent among many of Richmond's better-off patients. So among Catholics, Anne Orr had visions of Daniel O'Connell. She also reportedly heard the voice of Charles Stewart Parnell, who she alleged every day called her bad names. John C., a soldier pensioner, reportedly talked in a silly, rambling, incoherent manner about Mrs. O'Shea, who Parnell famously had an affair with. He also spoke of priests and bloody fenians. Protestant patients, though, were equally preoccupied with political figures. Mary F. stated, "I am Queen Victoria," and later, "I am Robert Peel's wife." And Hannah Louisa F. talked incoherently about Mrs. O'Shea, who was clearly a popular target, while Fanny M. referred to Mr. Gladstone as a beast. So the prominence of these issues surrounding class, religious, and political tensions in the case notes and paying patients, I think, says much about contemporary medical practitioners' perceptions of mental illness. Reporting physicians clearly felt it worthwhile to record patients' anxieties about their political and social status. But these tensions also inform us about patients' own experiences. Those in district asylums occupied a precarious social position between the poor and the middle classes, and I think it's likely that many were anxious to reassert their respectability when accommodated alongside paupers in district asylums. Now, I think this is further reflected in the lack of political, class, or religious tensions recorded among voluntary asylum patients. In these hospitals, charity patients were usually housed separately from those who paid fees, and this guarded against any jealousies or class tensions which might otherwise have arisen. Now, voluntary asylums tended to have an inherently religious ethos. As Maria Luddy has found, charitable provision in 19th century Ireland was denominational provision, and this certainly extended to asylums. So the two asylums we're looking at today, the Bloomfield Retreat, was founded by Quakers. It received mainly Quakers, but there was also a disproportionate number of Protestants, very few Catholics, and therefore less tensions between these two groups. The other asylum I'm mentioning, Stewart's, was founded by Dr. Henry Hutchinson Stewart, whose father was a Protestant reverend, and it also received mainly Protestants. So patients in these asylums tend to be drawn from the same social as well as religious backgrounds, guarding against a lot of the tensions which arose among district asylum patients. Okay, and then moving on quickly to the second part of my paper. For the remainder of this paper, I want to talk about the contrasting experiences of fee. Okay. So, as I was saying, moving on to the second part, I want to talk about the contrasting experiences of fee-paying patients in terms of the work they were given to perform in asylums and the amusements they were given to distract them. These were very much important parts of moral treatment, which was the treatment du jour, really, during much of the 19th century. In Enniscorthy and Richmond asylums, employment was seen as a key element of asylum life. The social superiority displayed by many of the patients in these asylums might suggest they were reluctant to work there. And certainly historians in the English context have found that patients in private asylums were very reluctant to conduct any manual labour, which they viewed as menial and degrading. But I did find that many of the Irish paying patients, particularly those housed at lower sums, were more than willing to work, and actually some asked to be given work. Several patients who were previously farmers worked on the asylum farm. This was similar in Britain, where historians have found that asylum authorities expected able-bodied patients to perform work wherever practicable. So many of the ladies tended to perform things like needlework. The men were more productively employed at things like painting and crafting. Thomas G., a civil service pensioner, worked as a clerk as well. So these examples clearly indicate that paying patients, a number of whom were skilled, could be employed advantageously by the asylum. So while, as Cherry has suggested, working in familiar areas might be considered therapeutic for the patients, fostering an ability to return to the workplace following discharge, in terms of Irish paying patients, the asylum also benefited from this influx of skilled workers capable of painting, mending and crafting as the authorities wished. Now, in contrast to this, the voluntary asylum records I've looked at, very few patients were actually engaged in any employment, and I think, as I said, this sort of reflected that they came from a higher rank of society. They did, however, receive a lot more of a diverse experience in terms of the amusements they were given. So we find lots of examples of patients being allowed to leave the asylum, and two male patients found an advert in a newspaper for a concert, and they were allowed to go in the care of an attendant. They also went for country walks and tourist attractions and sports and picnics. So just to wrap up quickly, and I'm sorry I've gone over time, to conclude, because the voluntary patients were exempt from the rules dictating district asylum practice, they really could provide a more varied and stimulating asylum experience to the patients, which was completely at odds with more familiar characterisations of the monotony of asylum life. Thank you.